All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. And of course, I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today I am joined by Matt Waldman of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. And we are going to break down this 2022 running back class and find the players that fit the Atlanta Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. You can find all the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcasts Monday through Friday, each and every day on your favorite podcast platform, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course, on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to all of the variations of the Locked On Falcons as well as Locked On Sports Atlanta shows. And we want to thank you for making those shows your first listen each and every day. Today's episode is all about the running back position. We spend a lot of time on this podcast talking quarterbacks and pass rushers or whatever the case may be. And today we're going to be focusing on that running back position. And today I'm joined by none other than Matt Waldman. I really enjoy Matt's work. He does a lot of fantasy write-ups with Rookie Scouting Portfolio and, is projecting these guys in terms of what they can do, not only in what I call reality football, but also in fantasy football. And we had Matt on last year to talk about last year's running back class because we thought, hey, the Falcons need to go out there and get a running back that can fit this offense. They didn't draft somebody. They did pick up two undrafted free agents, Javian Hawkins and Caleb Huntley. Caleb Huntley's still with the team. And this year, we're right back in the same place. Hey, let's bring Matt on and talk about this year's running back class. And hopefully the Falcons will actually draft a player this year. And so we'll get Matt's thoughts on sort of who are the players that really fit for this offense. But Matt, I really appreciate you coming back on the show.
Oh, man, it's always a pleasure. And I get to talk shop with you and to be able to do it with a team that, is my hometown team. So it's nice to be able to do a show like this.
And speaking of that hometown team, let's talk a little bit about the sort of transition that the Falcons may be undergoing a little bit before we get into this running back class, because we've spent basically over a decade, with Matt Ryan as the quarterback, with some high-flying weapons like Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley and Roddy White and Tony Gonzalez and now Kyle Pitts. And all those guys, except for Kyle Pitts, are gone. But this has been a pass-first team. You knew that the Falcons' bread was buttered in throwing the football, and Matt Ryan's gone, and you got Marcus Mariota coming in, and we know that he wasn't necessarily executing these pass-heavy attacks in Tennessee. We know that Arthur Smith comes from that Tennessee offense where it was sort of spearheaded by a Derrick Henry type of running game. And you sort of look towards the future of the Falcons, and we don't know what their future is at the quarterback in terms of their long-term future. Maybe they get a quarterback this year. Maybe they wait till next year. But you imagine, similar to what we saw with Matt Ryan 14 years ago, that, being able to, quote-unquote, establish the run will be very friendly to a young quarterback as the Falcons develop that player, not only for whether it's Marcus Mariota this year or a young quarterback in the future. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on sort of this notion that the Falcons could and should be maybe transitioning back to what they were almost 15 years ago, which was this sort of run-first identity?
I think there is some positives to take away from it, because as we saw last year, the NFL started to realize that they needed to force these young quarterbacks and spread offenses to slow down, be more patient by playing a lot of drop 8, cover 8 type of looks that forced them to be patient and check down or run the ball. And a lot of the top offenses started to struggle a little bit because the younger quarterbacks weren't patient enough to do it. And Kansas City is a great example of that. And you're going to see more of that in the NFL because the trend has been going towards these spread offenses. So that means that if you're following what the trend has been, you're now too late. Now it's about how are you going to be the trend setter? And the trend setter is to look at what the defense has done defenses are doing to catch up to that and say, well, how do you take teams out of a cover 8 shell? How do you keep them out of the cover 2 and the drop 8 and the mirrors and all that? Well, you run the ball, you run it down their throat. You face the dime defenders or the nickel defenders, instead of linebackers. Now you've got these safety hybrid types, and you just run right through them. And Atlanta certainly, they've been trying to build the line to work towards being able to do that a little bit more. You get a top tight end in Kyle Pitts, who is a capable blocker if you want to put him in line a little bit. And with Arthur Smith's mentality, it makes sense. And especially with a quarterback like Mariota, who, if we're going to be at our most pessimistic, we would say he's a journeyman and a bridge to another quarterback. But he's one that knows Arthur Smith's system. He's one who understands, who can run the football. And he's at his best on designed running plays.
Mm-hmm.
He's very mobile, but he's not a great scrambler. He's not the pocket manager Matt Ryan was. Few are actually, but design rollouts, design type of movement and running plays that get him outside so that you create a lot of variety and unpredictability with your ground game between your back, your quarterback, and then whatever you want to call Cordero Patterson, you want to call him your running back, you want to have Davis or the running back that they draft in the backfield, and Patterson coming out on a jet sweep, and then you fake both those and run Mariota. You have these types of things that you can do to create unpredictability in your run game, and then use play action off of that to create easier opportunities down the field for Mariota, and match up Kyle Pitts and other receivers in positive ways, especially if Kyle Pitts is inside and then he has to, leak out from the backside off of these play actions, and he's got a linebacker on him because they had to play the run. So there's a lot of good things that can come into this if it executed well.
Yeah. And we'll continue today's conversation with Matt Waldman, talking a little bit more specifically about this 2022 running back class and see if they can find some guys that can help them better execute that running game in this upcoming draft. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug again the Locked On Atlanta Sports podcast family. In addition to all the great shows that you get, like Locked On Falcons, Locked On Braves, you definitely want to tune into that with baseball kicking off, or batting off, I guess, today. You also can find the daily shows on the Locked On Sports Atlanta feed on the same podcast platforms. You can find Locked On Falcons, and you get 3 separate shows with 3 great personalities. Those folks from 680 The Fan and 92.9 The Game, and they cover all Atlanta sports, and will certainly be covering some of the national headlines that stand out, such as the Masters and more. And so check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on your preferred podcast platform. And guys, it is a sort of a big day for sports. The opening day for Major League Baseball. You got the Masters. This weekend, you got UFC 273. Later this month, you got the NBA playoffs. Next month, you got the NHL playoffs. And sandwich in between that is, the 2022 NFL draft that me and Matt are talking about. And if you're watching the Braves and take on the Reds this weekend, or you're watching Tiger Woods do his thing down in Augusta, Georgia, and that's not exciting enough for you, maybe you find a little bit more excitement by putting a little bit of money on those sporting events. And all you got to do is head on over to betonline.net, the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. And whether it's baseball, golf, NBA, NHL, or the 2022 NFL draft, the BetOnline has you covered with all the latest odds, contests, and props. And speaking of props, the NFL props are great at betonline.net. You can bet on who's going to win the AFC North, who's going to be the number 1 pick, which team is going to select Malik Willis. Falcons, it's the Panthers, it's the Steelers, the Saints, who knows? BetOnline has it all, so head to the website at betonline.net and sign up today. BetOnline, where the game starts. So continuing today's conversation with Matt Waldman of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. Matt, what are your thoughts on the overall 2022 running back class? It doesn't seem like we have any star players like we've had in some recent years that sort of stand out. This is the guy. But it does seem like there's a deep class that, if you're waiting until those middle rounds of the draft and maybe the day 3 of the draft, you can find some really good value in this draft class. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is. I would even say that there's probably 2 guys in this class who are good enough to be almost in that conversation of capable of being lead backs right away. Maybe even you could probably even argue three to four backs who have that potential, even though they're not considered stars. But this is a deep class, and fortunately for Atlanta, there's a lot of teams that really don't need a running back at this stage, at least on the surface. So while it seems like for a lot of conversations I have, I always lead in saying this is a deep class with a lot of talent, but there's not a lot of demand for the position. So a lot of these guys may fall and wind up being labeled by a coaching regime as more of a reserve due to draft capital. And then in 2 years, when that coach gets fired and there's turnover on that team, the new coach comes in and is kind of like, well, this guy really isn't my guy. A minor degree example of that would be Kadri Allison, who was, an interesting late round pick out of Pittsburgh, who worked his way up. But when the coaching changeover came, part of it was that they were looking at other players, but he got cut. And then I think Arthur Smith saw what Allison was able to do when they needed him a little bit and said, yeah, maybe we were a little hasty. He may not have been one of my guys when I came into camp here. He may have been the last regime's guy, but he's not bad, especially for special teams, and he can help in a pinch. Now, obviously, they're going to be looking for somebody to bump him off the roster again, but it's those kind of situations, but even more pronounced where there's some players in this class who might be fifth, sixth round picks or seventh round picks or even undrafted free agents who could emerge into a contributor role.
Now, you talk about there's one or two guys in this draft class that could be sort of that feature running back heading right in the NFL. And, we know with Arthur Smith, he had a lot of success with a Derrick Henry type of player. I'm going to assume that there is no Derrick Henry type of player, but then again, Derrick Henry wasn't exactly expected to be Derrick Henry when he came into the NFL. That's why I think he was like the fourth or fifth running back taken in that draft in round 2, and then was relatively quiet for the first 2 years in his NFL career, sort of splitting time there. And then we saw him sort of explode once, Tennessee made the switch to the outside zone running scheme under Matt LaFleur, and then continue that under, Arthur Smith. But I guess I'm curious, is there a running back in this draft class, or who are those running backs in this draft class that, may not necessarily follow that same path that Derrick Henry had, but, in a few years, we could be talking about, this guy potentially being one of the 5 to 10 best running backs in the NFL. Is there that type of player in this league, in this draft?
There are a few that could possibly get there. Yeah. I think Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker are the two that, from the standpoint of what they can offer a team, are at the top of the board. Breece Hall, both of them are scheme diverse in terms of that you can use them in outside zone, inside zone, gap plays. Walker's a little more diverse in the sense that he can run duo, which is more of a very tight crease blocking scheme type of play that you have to be very fluent at working between tight creases. So both of them are very good because they have the explosion, the short area quickness, the acceleration, and the long speed, and they carry the load well. Walker's more of a Ray Rice type, low to the ground, or a J.K. Dobbins type. And the Ravens are a power running team, and if they can, they don't mind a short. He's not small. He's short type of player, and that's what Kenneth Walker is. And Hall really has all the talent to become a high-end producer in this league with the breakaway speed. He reminds me a lot of a mix of two different tracks of players, in the sense that in one way you can see the ability to kind of glide and make one cut downhill and get into that crease and be a really strong cutback runner like a Matt Forte, or way back in the day, Robert Smith, the former Ohio State star with the Vikings, and just look like he's just breezing, just gliding by people. But then he also has some of the short area change of direction creativity that you see from a back like LaShawn McCoy at his, heyday. So they're kind of two parts of the whole. He sometimes makes it a little too easy, but he's a fine back. I think down the line, Brian Robinson, who is, Alabama back, just like Henry, who isn't nearly as big as Henry, but he's a big, strong back. He reminds me, if you remember Kansas City back in the early 2000s, Priest Holmes running mate Larry Johnson for a time. There's a lot of Larry Johnson in his game. He has the short area quickness. He can pass protect. He has soft hands, and there's no shame in him sitting behind some of the runners that he's worked behind during his career. And when he's been on the field, he's played very well, and he's gotten better both physically and conceptually in his game. Some other guys that I think could surprise would include Isaiah Pacheco out of Rutgers, who is well within the range of what I think Atlanta would want to look for an outside zone runner. He's in the 210, 215 pound range. Probably could get to 220. Very fast. He runs a lot of gap plays at Rutgers that didn't work out well. And so when you know that you're having to if you have the feeling you need to look at your watch to see if your pulling guard's going to get around on time, you know you're about to get planted, so you need to take action yourself. And so he gets criticized for being a shaky decision maker in some cases, but from what I studied in depth, he didn't have many choices in some of those plays that he gets criticized for. And he's a very good pass catcher in terms of hand-eye coordination. He reminds me a little Cam Akers. I think that he could give you that kind of Cam Akers style of play. Another outside zone guy like Pierre Strong is certainly he's a smaller guy, but gives you that Kevin Coleman kind of outside zone speed. But your bigger dudes that have the burst and speed to do it. Abram Smith out of Baylor. Listen, he was a former linebacker. He has 2 ACL tears, and that scares people, but he is the most natural outside zone runner in this class. He makes it. It's like sometimes there are guys, and I'm rare to look at it this way, but occasionally there are guys who they just have a good feel for a scheme, and he has a feel for how to press and find cutbacks and where his blocks are setting up and how to manipulate linebackers that you would see from a veteran outside zone runner in the NFL. And he's big enough, and he doesn't have great cutting ability, but it's that one cut is more than enough for him, and he does run for power. Not a great receiver, but if you pair him, he's a guy you get on the second or third day, and he could be good. And then maybe other guys I would just add real quick to take a chance on that might be interesting from that size standpoint. Tyrion Davis-Price of LSU, excellent pass protector, surprisingly fast. And when he's on his game, I think the way he cuts downhill and transitions, because one of the most important things you need to do as an outside zone runner is to be able to transition within a minimal number of steps from an outside heading track to a downhill track so that you can really press those outside lanes. And Tyrion Davis-Price does that as well as any back in this class. And while he has had shaky production because in terms of what people look for in a first day guy, the skills are there for him.
See, this is why I love talking with you, Matt, because you always, dropping knowledge in terms of sort of the traits and the parts of the evaluation that really make a ton of sense. You're talking about some of these running backs that have this fit in this outside zone scheme that the Falcons were utilizing quite a bit last year under Arthur Smith as sort of staple of that Shanahan style of offense as the foundation of their sort of offense. And then you mentioned at the top of the show, building sort of off of that with the play action and whatnot. I guess my question is for you, Isaiah Spiller, right? He's a running back that has been touted as one of the top guys alongside guys like Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker. Where does he sort of fit in potentially in a place like Atlanta? And are you maybe concerned a little bit that maybe he didn't test as well as I think some of these other guys did? And does that affect your evaluation of him on the next level?
It's a great question. And where he really didn't test well was speed, his long speed. And I'm more of a proponent that short area change of direction and acceleration are far more important than long speed. And if you want some great examples of that, you can look at Frank Gore, who ran in any system and had Pro Bowl caliber years and played longer at a running back position than pretty much anybody. Or you can look at Terrell Davis and see that he was a 4.6 runner or Arian Foster, who also ran in this system, who ran, I think, a 4.72 at his 40. But all of them have the short area acceleration and change of direction speed. And Spiller has terrific footwork. He's worked on his footwork for years, since the Footwork King who's a very popular Instagram trainer who trains with a lot of guys. He's told me that he recommends his high school kids to watch a lot of my tape on that I do on social media. And one of those pupils was Spiller back in the day, ironically enough. But when I've graded Spiller, the footwork, you can tell he's worked on it. You can see that he has answers and solutions for things that come up that are very efficient, but he can also be dynamic when he needs to. The issue that I have with Spiller isn't so much speed. It's that when he runs certain types of plays, usually gap plays like counter, he thinks he can out-athlete people, and he'll ignore the blocking scheme for trying to outrun people, as opposed to setting up maybe the force defender on the outside with, pressing a little deeper and then cutting back in behind his puller, thinking he can run around people. But that's a maturity issue that a lot of young backs have at this level. So Spiller is an ideal fit for an outside zone. He would be I think he's a fine player. He reminds me a little bit of a mix of guys like Ryan Matthews from the Chargers when he was in his heyday, or maybe even Deuce McAllister if really things went right. Now that's an old name for folks, but still, he's that type of player that can carry the load for you. He can give you a variety of work in different schemes. He has enough acceleration and power when his hips and pads are aligned to do the job. It's just, for me, he has details of his game that sometimes have lapses a little more often than what you see from Kenneth Walker or Breece Hall. But he's still in my top 5 easily. And I think most backs who can either be good gap runners and have enough speed and burst to the outside, or already play outside zone, they'll all be good fits for what Atlanta wants.
Well, Matt, you're in the correct place to drop names like Deuce McAllister, because I still sometimes wake up in cold sweats remembering some of the games he had against the Falcons. He was definitely a Falcon killer from 20 years ago. But we'll continue today's conversation. Get a little bit more thoughts on Matt in terms of some of these other players that could wind up fitting here in Atlanta. We'll talk a little bit more about Brian Robinson. He's a guy that I certainly covet. We'll get more in depth on that. And we'll do that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, I do want to plug the Locked On NFL podcast that's covering all 32 teams, including the Atlanta Falcons. And of course, you can find Locked On NFL on your preferred podcast platform, whether that's Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, or on YouTube. And guys, I want to tell you also about Built Bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. It's even better than a candy bar because Built Bars not only taste good, they're good for you because they're low in sugar, calories, and carbs, but high in protein and fiber. And all month long, Built Bar has been promoting their puff flavors. Puffs are their first protein-infused marshmallow. They're fluffy, marshmallowy goodness. They come in a variety of flavors. The brownie batter puff, you got the coconut marshmallow, and 'tis the season for Easter. And if you're a big fan of Peeps, Built Bar's even got you covered there with their yellow chirps, their first mini puff flavor. But if you're not necessarily into the chocolate and marshmallow, maybe you want to check out one of their tried and true flavors. I myself just ordered a box of raspberry cheesecake. You can go check that out. You can get the caramel brownie that's on sale, as well as so many others. So order a mixed box of the regular flavors or order a mixed box of the puffs by heading over to built.com. And when you do use the promo code LOCKED15, you'll get 15% off your order. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So, Matt, you already mentioned a bunch of players that really fit the Falcons. I'm a big fan of Brian Robinson, and I just need people to stay low key on Brian Robinson because he's the guy I've had my eye on for several months now. And just I'm glad when I see people's rankings and they don't have Brian Robinson in the top 5. I'm like, yes, no one get excited about Brian Robinson so the Falcons can land him as a steal somewhere, potentially in the 3rd or 4th round or whatever the case may be. And I feel like Brian Robinson in particular probably does not get the same level of hype that we normally know for Alabama running backs, because we're so used to these Alabama running backs being these 5-star recruits that show up day one on campus and are immediate, star players as freshmen. And Brian Robinson just basically rode the bench for 3 years and only saw the field as a senior, and sort of people are dismissing him. But he is certainly a player that I've had my eye on and been secretly coveting for several months. You know, am I in good spaces for the Brian Robinson love?
Yeah, he's my running back 4 in this class, and I have a starter grade for him. He's on the tier of for my on the cusp, excuse me, of the starter tier, like immediate starter, and which is a pretty high grade. And that means that he essentially can do it. What I love about him is that while he can run gap heavy runs, if you want him to do that, I thought about him as when I first wrote him up last year before he decided to stay. I thought, the Titans might want to give Donta Foreman competition for the primary backup spot, back then, and now it's like, well, that fits with Smith's scheme, and what I like about him most is that he's shifty for his size, but he also has no illusions about what he needs to be when it's time to get downhill. So you have a physical runner with precise footwork who has a good feel for different types of schemes to run. And so when efficient footwork is extremely important because it helps you create solutions. People love the jump cuts. They love the wide ranging lateral cuts. And that's helpful when you're desperate. But when what often happens is the NFL can make mistakes where they pick players like another Alabama back, Kenyon Drake, who I'd watch him in Miami for his first few years. And there's a reason they brought Frank Gore in, which was to teach him how to be efficient with his footwork, because he used to jump cut into the backside of his guards, trying to avoid penetration because he couldn't make the efficient cut. And he'd wind up hitting his head literally on a blocker and fall backwards. I've seen it happen multiple times in games where because he didn't know how to really set things up. And it's those short steps and understanding how those steps time up with your blocks. And Robinson has those skills, and he has the smaller moves. I call them micro movements. Ezekiel Elliott is great at that. The best backs can just make a small dip of the shoulder, a little turn of the head, a little bit of lifting their foot a little bit higher. Alvin Kamara is great at it, in the ability to make people miss or not get perfect angles on them. They had perfect angles. Now they have unfavorable angles with just a small change. And Robinson has some of that to his game. So overall, you're getting a power runner who knows how to be efficient and has quick enough feet of like a scat back in some regards, even though he's not going to be as flashy as that, but gives you the potential for a 3-down guy. So yeah, if the Falcons get Brian Robinson, that is a very strong selection for them.
Now, you've mentioned several players that fit, and one of the things that probably Falcon fans listening and watching know that when they look at the types of players that seemingly this coaching staff they basically over the last year, every running back with the exception of Javian Hawkins, who didn't last particularly long last year as an undrafted free agent, they've added over the last year has been 220 plus pounds. Cordero Patterson, Mike Davis, Quadri Olison, Damian Williams this offseason. They had Donta Foreman in briefly in the summer before he went back to Tennessee. They seem to have a type. And you've already mentioned a couple of those guys that are in that 215 plus 220 pound range. Brian Robinson's another one of those guys. Are there more guys in this draft class that sort of fit that bill that could potentially be some late round guys if the board doesn't necessarily fall for the Falcons? Or are potentially there are other guys that may not necessarily fit that prototype, but would still be really great fits in the outside zone scheme that the Falcons could potentially, mine late in this draft?
Without a doubt. The first one that comes to mind for me as a late round guy is Keaontay Ingram out of USC, who used to be a 5-star recruit from Texas, but Bijan Robinson, that train got rolling early, and Ingram got hurt, and he moved on to USC. But when you watch Ingram, he has great change of direction skill and excellent vision to create solutions. When you think of Devonta Freeman in Atlanta, when he had to create a lot on his own in situations and he turned 3-yard losses into 8-yard gains, Keaontay Ingram has that kind of caliber of change of direction and vision and understanding the blocking scheme to do all of that work. He's not a speedster, but he's extremely quick and good accelerator who catches the ball well. He reminds me at worst of like Chris Ivory when he was in New Orleans, I'm mentioning a lot of New Orleans guys in this show. But
they all had 100-yard games against the Falcons. So
there you go. But like on the higher end, maybe more of a Kareem Hunt type. He's 6 feet 222, and he's one of my favorite runners out of this class because he can catch, he can run for power, he can go inside and outside. Very good cutback runner. Kevin Harris probably will go earlier than Ingram, but he has underrated speed. And he is a tough physical runner who can catch the ball. But two players that I really feel compelled to mention. One of them is if you feel good about getting a guy late that you hope you can work into a good role. The other South Carolina back, Zamir White, is a raw player. Okay, like what he does well, he's reacting to, and he has all the flashy movements of a Kenyon Drake. But I think if he can work with some people and show that he's a fast enough learner to be able to really get a good feel for setting up blocks, even more than what he's flashed at South Carolina, I think he could be a top starter in this league. He has the tackle breaking ability, he has the excellent movement, the speed, the burst. He can catch the ball, though. All these things have lapses, and they're wide ranges of lapses. But when I don't like to logo scout, but if I were to characterize South Carolina's program, I will say that I've had a lot of coaches in that region kind of write me after I've talked about that program a little bit, and they say, "Listen, you were nice about it, but what we're going to tell you is that they recruit athletes, but these guys don't necessarily get developed to the level that they're capable of developing, and it can be a bit of a turnstile, and there's a lot of athletic potential that comes out, but whether they actually make good on it is a different story." So he's the athlete that you're going for the high upside that maybe he can turn into a guy who's aspiring to be a Clinton Portis or a Joe Mixon one day. He has that kind of physical skill. The guy who's the opposite of that, who if I've kind of been saying, listen, if someone would give me money and just said, "Listen, we're gonna give you $100,000 and you're gonna bet, you can only use it to bet on something, just like as a long shot. We need you to pick a long shot prop, and if there was such a prop as who could be the next Terrell Davis." Potential Terrell Davis in this class, it would be Kennedy Brooks out of Oklahoma. Kennedy Brooks is not going to ride the ride for for the size that you're looking for out of Arthur Smith's desires, but at the same time, 5'11", 209, he could probably add another 5 to 10 pounds of muscle and maybe get there. I mean, Terrell Davis was 195 when he came out of Georgia, so. Like Terrell Davis, he's about 4'6", runner. Not very impressive on the athletic quotient, but all he does is identify pre-snap what is favorable for him to make an adjustment to based on box counts, make defenders miss, bounce off hits from all three levels of defenders, and turn gains that look like 3 to 5 yard gains into 8 to 15 yard gains, and occasionally even break 40, 50 yard runs for you. And there are a lot of good backs at Oklahoma in recent years. And as DeMarco Murray, a player I remember interviewing at the Senior Bowl when he was coming out and talking about running backs a lot with him when I had the chance to cover him, he talks about him. He said, "Look, we had better athletes, and we tried to get him off the field, but all he did was just outplay everybody." He's a very intelligent running back who people just can't get an angle on, and the most patient running back in this class. So, he may not be a high round pick, but if there was a back that I was just going to say, somebody told me you've got to make a long shot bet, that would be the guy.
Okay. I think it's interesting that you mentioned two South Carolina running backs because the Falcons' former running backs coach, who's now the offensive coordinator at UVA, was also the running backs coach at South Carolina a couple of years ago. And so you kind of wonder, okay, like maybe that's, they got a little bit of inside track on that coaching staff to go after someone like a Harris or a Quan White or whatever the case may be. So they also, that same person, Des Kitchens, was at NC State. There's 2 NC State running backs in this draft class, and Zonovan Knight and Ricky Person. So it'll be interesting to see if the Falcons, go after one of those guys in this draft as well.
No doubt. And those guys are certainly interesting too. Knight has terrific contact balance. He's another one who's not particularly fast, but he's a smart running back with great power, great contact balance. He runs a lot bigger than his size would indicate. Same with Zamir White, the Georgia product. You would think he's 220, and when you find out he's 206, you're like, well, he runs 20 pounds heavier than he looks. And he's another guy that is underrated from that perspective. There are going to be a lot of people who like Rashad White for his speed. I'm not in that camp, but I can understand why people will look at backs like that. But for me, if I'm looking late, Abram Smith, Keaontay Ingram, those 2 guys really lead the list from the size perspective. Tyrion Davis-Price as well. And then if you're looking for the smarts, but maybe not the speed, quickness as much as those other guys have, then Zonovan Knight, Damian Pierce of Florida, Kennedy Brooks are all really smart backs who just find ways to get yards.
Yeah. So, this is only scratching the surface of the many talented running backs in this draft class. And if people want to get a little bit more insight into Matt's thoughts on some of the running backs in this draft class, of course, they should check out the rookie scouting portfolio. He not only talks running backs, talks receivers, talks tight ends, talks quarterbacks. And I know Matt has some differing perspectives on some of the quarterbacks than necessarily the mainstream evaluators do. And so highly recommend people checking out the rookie scouting portfolio. Matt, go ahead and plug, what people are getting with that product. I ordered my copy earlier today as prep for today's episode, and it was, trying to get to the running back section in it. So that I could have an intelligent conversation with you today, but I kept reading the quarterback profiles as how it goes. So let the people know sort of what type of insight they're getting in that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm 17 years into this publication, and this is a draft guide specifically, like Aaron said, for the 4 position groups. And what you get for $21.95 is the pre-draft, a post-draft analysis, as well as a newsletter that comes out throughout the year. And the pre-draft is literally 1,000 pages long of content. And what I do is I take you through a process that I've developed that really shows you how to scout players, and it gives you room to be able to make your own assessments if you want to. But I rank the players in 2 different ways in terms of depth of talent, breadth of talent. I give you charts and cheat sheets so that you can just access information quickly if you want to. Say you play in fantasy league, because I have made my living also as a fantasy writer. So, while the RSP is my main income, the fantasy thing is something I've been doing for over 20 years and I'm well established with. So it's football approved, but with fantasy appeal. Mm-hmm. And when I say football approved, according to Alex Brown, who is the head of recruiting for SMU and has worked with Rice as the head of recruiting there, as well as Houston, he says that when he meets with scouts on a regular basis, the 2 draft guides that he sees most commonly from independent draft guides that scouts have and personnel people have is mine and Dave Brugler's. So, that you can check it out at mattwaldman.com. You get way more for your money than you would expect in terms of the rankings, the analysis, how I break players down, a glossary of all the terms that I use and define, the weighted grading scale, so that it's very clear what I do. And even my comparisons are based on a spectrum of historical players. The post-draft is a great fantasy guide that also weighs draft capital after that. So you get kind of my unvarnished look pre-draft, my, you get my more draft capital aided look of players post-draft, has nice shelf life. And, for that $21.95, I donate up to $5,000 every year to Darkness to Light, an organization devoted to preventing sexual abuse of children, and by training people, organizations, universities, government groups on how to identify potential factors that may lead to that, as well as how to handle it when the trauma occurs so that it doesn't compound the trauma for children. We've raised over $50,000 for them in the past 10 years, and we'll continue to, donate to them this year. And very proud of that.
Absolutely. So, not only getting great information for the future on football, but also, donating to a worthy cause. So definitely go, guys, check that out at mattwaldman.com. And Matt, I appreciate you coming on this podcast. Hopefully, unlike last year, the Falcons will actually draft some of these players that you're breaking down in this scouting portfolio, and we can have you back on after the draft to give your assessment on some of these guys in terms of their fit, particularly at the running back position. But I'm having a feeling that we might be talking quarterbacks and wide receivers and tight ends as well in those future conversations. So I really appreciate you coming on today's episode and look forward to our future conversations.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
So, guys, that's going to do it for us here on this week of Locked On Falcons. Again, want to plug the rest of the Locked On Sports Atlanta shows, A to Z with Mark Zinno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste. In addition to Locked On Braves, check out opening day coverage, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, as the Hawks are, headed towards the postseason. Didn't seem like that was probable a couple months ago, but now that they're on that path. So you can check out all those shows on your preferred podcast platform. And next week, we'll be kicking off, of course, on Monday with a mock draft Monday, and don't know which player we'll be breaking down and whose mock draft we'll be breaking down, but always check out Locked On Falcons. And if you want to provide your feedback to anything we've discussed on today's episode, anything we've discussed on past episodes, or anything you want me to discuss on future episodes, of course, you can hit me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons, on Facebook or Twitter. Of course, the email address is lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, guys. I appreciate you. I hope you check out Matt Waldman's rookie scouting portfolio. Of course, you can check out Dane Brugler's Beast that just dropped as well today. And, of course, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, which you can find on the same podcast platform which you can find Locked On Falcons, as they will certainly be doing Mock Draft Monday again on Monday. So, guys, appreciate Matt for coming on. I hope everybody watching and listening has a great weekend.